Part 2. Getting Started. Chapter 3. Harnessing the Fear of Failure. Go tell the Spartans, thou who passeth by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. John Dryden on the Spartans at Thermopylae. The 800-pound gorilla. This is the 800-pound gorilla, the King Kong of your nightmares, the reason, almost certainly, that you've not already begun to make yourself rich. He's a big bastard, so arm wrestling is out, but he's not quite as scary as you might think. Maybe we can bribe him with a sack of bananas, or poison him, or teach him to sit up and beg. Let's see. Not begun until half done, lectured John Keats gloomily in a letter to a relative nearly 200 years ago. Keats was a sublime poet who died when just 25 years old. Although he would rank well inside my own top 20 favourite writers of verse in English, perhaps in the top 10, he would have made a totally rotten entrepreneur. I would use instead, once begun, the job's half done. Because taking that first irrevocable step has proved to be the most difficult part of nearly every venture I've been involved in. In the memorable words of the American philosopher and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, no matter how much faculty of idle seeing a man has, the step from knowing to doing is rarely taken. There are so many reasons not to do anything, many of them highly persuasive, especially in the mouth of a Jeremiah, and the world is full of Jeremiahs. They infest our planet. In the living room, in the pub, in the office, at the boardroom table, everywhere you look, you will find men and women who appear to take perverse pleasure in pointing out the shriekingly obvious, that if a new venture does not succeed, it may result in failure. Not that they will say so in so many words. It would be so much easier to overcome the bulk of their objections if they did. Instead, they trot out facts and figures, statistics and trends, charts and graphs, together with endless reminders of failures of the past, with a special emphasis on the failures of those lucky enough not to be in the room at the time. There is rarely any mention of their own failures in my experience. They will say the company or the individual does not have the resources, that it has all been tried before, that the light isn't worth the candle, that outside advice is required, or that an individual should seek further counsel, that the individual or company is uniquely unsuited to such an enterprise, that it is too late or too early for such an idea to have any chance of succeeding. How many millions upon millions of man-hours are wasted annually, I wonder, in all this doom-mongering? Personally, I've had a bellyful of it. At the last extremity, as far as most company enterprises are concerned, the Jeremiahs will call in the big guns. We must form a committee to investigate the possibility of proceeding. That's the answer, a committee. Who shall we choose to chair the committee? This is the death knell in 9 cases out of 10 for any new venture. What lies behind it is the desire to apportion blame that may accrue later as widely as possible. If a committee is formed and eventually makes its recommendations, then future blame for either action or inaction cannot be laid at any one person's door. In business and political jargon, this nonsense is called collective responsibility. In common parlance, it is covering your backside. A committee is a cul-de-sac down which ideas are lured and quietly strangled, as Sir Barnet Cox, Clerk of the House of Commons, once pointed out. Well, Sir Barnet should certainly have known. He served on enough of them. Or, in the words of an anonymous American wit, a committee is a group of the unwilling, chosen from the unfit, to do the unnecessary. Just so, and they do it so brilliantly well. Whether in a college dorm or in the walnut-panelled boardroom of an international conglomerate, or around your own kitchen table. Of course, there is nothing wrong with robust debate, either with others or with oneself. What is undesirable, however, is the pretense that any such debate can resolve the risks involved in advance. It cannot. All debate can do is clarify, support, or contest the next step. The risks remain, however much talking is done. It is for this reason that committees are discouraged on the battlefield. A commander may be proved wrong, he may be proved right, but prompt decisions and orders, right or wrong, are far healthier than endless debate and prevarication. This applies equally to a debate within one's own mind. Fretting is counterproductive at any level. And so is lack of action. Knowing that fear of failure is holding you back is a step in the right direction, but it isn't enough, because knowing isn't doing. Knowing isn't doing what you need to do, my son. Telling me you know is only bluffing on the run. Knowing isn't doing. Doing isn't knowing. Nothing but the knowing and the doing gets it done. Fear of failure and the avoidance of blame, then, is what drives Jeremiah's and haunts them. To be fair, it haunts all of us. In essence, it comprises two components. The first is our natural desire to avoid letting ourselves or others down, perhaps with calamitous financial repercussions. The second is the exposure of that failure to the outside world. The majority of you listening to this now are mentally nodding in agreement. Otherwise, why would you be listening to a book called How to Get Rich? No shame there. Believe me, I have sat with colleagues and partners of long standing, many of them highly experienced, and listened in disbelief while they have talked themselves round and round in circles, or figures of 8, or any configuration designed to delay the agony of saying, "OK, let's do it." Or even, "OK, let's forget it." And looking back, I have to say that I regret the majority of the times I acquiesced in shilly-shallying and a retreat to safety. I would rather have tried and failed, in most cases, than have taken the safer course that so often appears to be wiser in the abstract. Back in the late 1970s, for example, I had a conversation with a much older man, a senior manager at the high street retailer W.H. Smith. W.H. Smith is a power in the magazine and newspaper industry. This old buffer was friendly and helpful towards my little publishing company. I was interested in launching a personal computer magazine. He dissuaded me, warning me over and over that nobody would ever pay money to read monthly magazines about dinky little computers. Several colleagues in my company agreed with him. After weeks of discussions, I abandoned my plans. Shortly thereafter, another entrepreneur, Angelo Zgorelec, launched just such a title called Personal Computer World. It soon exhibited all the signs of becoming a big success. Fortunately, Angelo did not have sufficient capital to promote it. In the nick of time, I was able to purchase a majority stake in the magazine, which I proceeded to sell for a small fortune 4 years later to a large conglomerate. So what's the lesson here? Because I had been dissuaded from launching my own title and did not own the magazine outright, I was forced to pay Angelo £1 million or so for his remaining share. Well done, Angelo! Had I launched a similar magazine myself earlier, I would have been £1 million richer in the autumn of 1982, around £2.4 million in today's money. If I had invested that £2.4 million at a low rate of compound interest, I would be £4 million richer than I am today. That is what that well-meaning old gentleman at W.H. Smith and his long-winded advice cost me. He cost me nearly $8 million in my pocket right now. And whose fault was it? It was mine. for prevaricating and listening to a Jeremiah. Let's return to the two components of fear of failure. Firstly, letting others or yourself down and the consequent financial calamity. My response is, so what? You may let others down if you act. You may let yourself down if you do not act. And just how calamitous will utter failure prove to be in any case? Which, of course, is what gives the young and penniless such a huge advantage in the race to get rich. They instinctively know what Bob Dylan preached 40 years ago. When you got nothing to lose. Still, potential loss is always an important consideration. Everything will depend on the degree of desire and belief you bring to an enterprise. What are you willing to sacrifice to achieve it? How great is the sacrifice in reality as opposed to your nightmarish fears at 3 o'clock in the morning? Does such a venture really risk utter destitution? Or is it far, far more likely that you fear the embarrassment of failure more than the possible financial penalty? This nastier, stickier second component, the broadcasting of our misjudgments or errors to the rest of the world, and especially to our peers, is often the nub of the matter. Whether I am sitting around with colleagues at Dennis Publishing trying to figure out if we should invest millions of pounds to launch a new car magazine, or whether a young woman, an only child not long out of college, is considering whether to take over her father's used car business or invest another 2 years of her life in obtaining a PhD in bioengineering, the same factors apply. Neither decision will involve utter financial ruin either way, but fear of attempting something, the result of which cannot be easily hidden, weighs heavily in the balance, whether we are aware of it or not. This applies not only to getting rich, but to almost all business and career-related decisions, and perhaps to the majority of all important decisions we make in our lives. The board of directors that runs Dennis Publishing will talk earnestly and sensibly about the effect on morale for the rest of the company, usually forgetting to mention their own morale, in the event our proposed new magazine bombs. Nobody ever mentions the loss to my personal bank balance or my morale. In reality, Dennis Publishing staff working, say, on The Week or Maxim or Computer Shopper won't give two hoots if the company's new car magazine is a sensational flop. But by discussing the matter in such terms, in code if you like, the board gives itself the opportunity to weigh their own fears while appearing to weigh the fears of others. Imputing desires or fears or loss of morale to others probably has a fancy psychological moniker, like auto-displacement activity, and it's not always a bad thing. At least it encourages serious communication, even if it adds little to the decision process. Even so, it is a form of well-disguised cowardice. On a less corporate level, the young woman mentioned above believes she would like a career in car sales management, especially as a part owner. She even believes that she might be able to expand her father's business a tad more aggressively than he has done in the past. On the other hand, a PhD would add status to her life and offers the prospect of a fulfilling career in science. But she must decide. Her father is unwell and cannot wait another 2 years for her decision. What if she takes over the company and it subsequently goes belly up? What if she shoots for a master's degree and does not achieve it? A failure to obtain her master's degree could be disguised fairly easily. It is not likely to be broadcast to the rest of the world. After all, she already has a degree. If failure seems likely, she can always quit, claiming she has become bored with bioengineering. The decision to take over her dad's company, however, will be far more closely monitored by relatives and neighbours, by the people who work there, by rival car dealerships, by the bank manager, and not least, by her father. Should she fail, she will run the risk of becoming a laughingstock or an object of pity. So, what's her best option? Much will depend on her desires and her goals in life. She is unlikely to get rich as a bioengineer, but she might well get rich expanding the dealership, especially because she is aware that her father has never invested to the extent that he might have done in marketing and promotion, especially on the internet. There is an opportunity. But is she prepared to exploit it? Why is she unlikely to get rich in bioengineering? Because starting up your own bioengineering firm takes vast quantities of capital and the persuasive abilities of a Richard Branson to obtain it. The car dealership, however, is already capitalized, and although she will have to pay off her father eventually, the repayments can be spread over a number of years. He is hardly likely to foreclose on her. So what should our young college girl do? Normally I would hesitate to offer any advice whatever, but I happen to know her. I was half in love with her once. She happens to be real, and her name is Julie. All this happened a long time ago. In the event, she took her degree and her father sold the business to an outsider. She is a highly competent bioengineer and has enjoyed her career enormously. But on more than one occasion she has told me she regrets not taking her father up on his offer. The passage of time and a happy marriage have softened that regret, but it's still there. It always will be, I think. What swung the balance was her fear of failure in such a public endeavour, or at least an endeavour that felt rather public at the time. She was young, she was a woman, she was frightened that others, especially the male-dominated community of car sales firms, would laugh at her or criticise her lack of hands-on experience, even though she would have made an excellent sales manager. She was not prepared to grow a carapace or to risk the fear of public humiliation and say, "To hell with them, let's go." Her decision still haunts her, if only from time to time, and it irks her to know that she will never be rich. It always irks intelligent people like Julie. And I can give you other examples. One of them is my mother. She will be furious if she ever reads this, that I have mentioned her in such a book and in such a context. But I know my mother well. I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that everything I have achieved I owe not just to care and love, but to her genes. She could have built herself a fortune had she wished. Her personality combines the resilience, the drive, and the restless energy of so many people who become rich. Like her eldest son, for instance. And that resilience and restless energy was always there with my mother, as it was with me, right from the beginning. But 60 years ago, it was almost unheard of for a woman to act out such ambitions. Her parents would have been scandalized. Neighbours would have viewed such behaviour in the most negative light imaginable. Had she failed, they would have nodded their donkey-like heads. Had she succeeded, horror of horrors, she would have earned their undying enmity. It just was not done for a woman to earn a fortune for herself, except somewhat dubiously, as a movie star perhaps, or a writer of crime novels. Single or newly married women from respectable families in the 1940s and 50s were actively discouraged from involvement in business except for a little light typing or serving in shops and department stores, especially if they had children, especially if they lived in the south of England, and this after they had helped to win a world war on the home front, but that was considered a vile aberration. Never mind that my mother had more brains in her little finger than half the twerps she worked for as an accountant. Why, women were not even allowed to sign a hire purchase form back then. They had to get their husband or brother or their father to do it. There were 100 obstacles and hurdles in those days, visible and invisible, to keep women in their place. which was firmly believed to be on a pedestal before marriage and in the kitchen and nursery directly afterwards. Fortunately for all of us, society has wised up somewhat, but the change came too late for my mother. So she didn't become rich. She had a decent career, that's all. She earned enough to support my brother and me and to provide us with more than just the necessities of life. And she married again and became a pillar of the community. But I know that she could have done it, had she been prepared for the unpleasantness, the sheer nastiness that would have been unleashed upon her if she'd chosen to say, "To hell with them, let's go." It was not so much a fear of failure on my mother's part, I believe, as a fear of upsetting the whole apple cart of the community in which she lived, which is why so very few women from her generation, so very, very few, ever did do it. They cared very much about what their neighbours thought, and now she is an elderly, if formidable lady, who quietly walks her dog along English country lanes. She knows all this, of course, and she, too, knows that she will never be rich, except through her eldest son, which is a subtly different thing. To sum up, then, if you wish to be rich, you must grow a carapace, a mental armour, not so thick as to blind you to well-constructed criticism and advice, especially from those whom you trust, nor so thick as to cut you off from friends and family, but thick enough to shrug off the inevitable sniggering and malicious mockery that will follow your inevitable failures, not to mention the poorly hidden envy that will accompany your eventual success. Few things in life are certain except death and being taxed, but sniggering and mockery prior to any attempt to better yourself financially, followed by envy later, or gloating during your initial failures, these are three certainties in life. It hurts, it's mindless, and it doesn't mean anything, but it will happen. Be prepared to shrug it off. The Germans have a superb word for the secret pleasure humans obtain from the misfortunes of others. It is Schadenfreude, from Schaden meaning harm, from which we get the word shadow, and Freude, meaning joy. Those of you who are definitely going to be rich will recognize it often in the faces and body language of idiots around you. It is the price you must learn to pay for any attempt to raise yourself in the world, and I suspect that was as true 10,000 years ago as it is today. Now comes the hard part. Before we really get started on getting started, I ask you to consider carefully the following short list. It is by no means comprehensive, nor will it be the last list in this book, but should you find yourself unable to measure up to even one of these initial demands, and I mean just one, then my suggestion is that you close this book and give it to a friend. If you are unwilling to fail, sometimes publicly, and even catastrophically, you stand very little chance of ever getting rich. If you care what the neighbours think, you will never get rich. If you cannot bear the thought of causing worry to your family, spouse, or lover while you plough a lonely, dangerous road rather than taking the safe option of a regular job, you will never get rich. If you have artistic inclinations, and fear that the search for wealth will coarsen such talents or degrade them, you will never get rich, because your fear in this instance is well justified. If you are not prepared to work longer hours than almost anyone you know, despite the jibes of colleagues and friends, you are unlikely to get rich. If you cannot convince yourself that you are good enough to be rich, you will never get rich. If you cannot treat your quest to get rich as a game, you will never be rich. If you cannot face up to your fear of failure, you will never be rich. The truth is that getting rich means sacrifice. And the worst of it is, it isn't always you, that's doing the sacrificing. You must get used to that or give up the quest. This is not a calling for the faint-hearted. There is no shame in turning away. After all, if everyone were prepared to make the necessary sacrifices, who would be left to work for my own companies? Quite apart from sacrifice, there is a last brutal truth to be confronted. If the fear of failure is holding you back, and it almost certainly is, then what strategies can be devised to set you free? No book, including mine, can do it for you. All I can do is alert you to the problem and suggest a course of action. Here is my suggestion. Think of this fear not as the King Kong of bogeymen, but as a mare, a nightmare. A mare, after all, is a horse. A horse can be tamed, bridled, saddled, harnessed, and eventually ridden. Harnessing the power of such a creature adds mightily to your own. Thus, the nightmare of prospective failure provides you with the very opportunity you're seeking. Not only does it restrain smarter people than yourself from becoming rich, and there can only be so many rich people in the world, it affords you the chance of increasing your confidence, both when you confront it and when you master it. For, make no mistake, if you will not confront and harness this all-too-human emotion in one way or another, then you are doomed to remain relatively poor. You either get over it, get round it, go at it, mount it, duck under it, or cozy up to it, but you cannot surrender to it. That way lies paralysis, prevarication, ignominy, and defeat. After a lifetime of making money and observing better men and women than I fall by the wayside, I am convinced that fear of failing in the eyes of the world is the single biggest impediment to amassing wealth. Trust me on this. If you shy away for any reason whatever, then the way is blocked. The gate is shut and will remain shut. You will never get started. You will never get rich.